Well, hello there people from the internet, how are you doing? We're back with part 2 of our road to Battlefield 1, and this time we're going to cover the aircraft from World War 1. In the previous video we've covered the start of the war, how the war got started. We also covered some of the early prototype tanks and how tanks played a huge and important role in World War 1. In this one we're just going to cover the aircraft. Now in the Battlefield 1 trailer we did get, I think it's about 5 or 6 planes, biplanes, Zeppelins and all that, and we're going to cover all that in this here video. At the start of World War 1, aircraft were very basic and crude. By the time World War 1 has ended, the aircraft has become far more sophisticated and had differentiated into fighters, bombers, long-range bombers. The development of aircraft was stimulated by the war's requirements, as was the way the aircraft were actually used. At the start of the war in August of 1914, British airmen were part of the British Army and commissioned officers had army ranks. By the end of the war in November of 1918, the Royal Flying Corps no longer existed and was absorbed into the newly created Royal Air Force. This had its own command structure away from the army and introduced its own ranks. Now the first ever recorded flight was in 1903 when the Wright brothers flew their aircraft. The first powered crossing of the English Channel was by Louis Blériot in 1909, therefore it could be expected that by 1914 aircraft remaining remarkably crude. In the autumn of 1914, a new recruit to the Royal Flying Corps had a greater chance of being killed during training than during combat. As World War I progressed, the military believed that the aircraft had a far greater value than just aerial reconnaissance and photography. Two entirely different forms of aircraft got developed, the fighter and the bomber. By November of 1918, there was no comparison between the aircraft that had finished the war and the aircraft that had started the war in 1914. In just 4 years, the changes brought by the war were absolutely huge. The British company Avro has produced one of the first aircraft used by the army in 1914, that is the 504. In fact, the first British aircraft shot down by the enemy in World War I was the Avro 504, flown by Lieutenant Waterfall. The first version was not so popular, but by version K, Avro had produced a reliable aircraft that developed a fine reputation. The Americans bought 52 of the Avro K. The Sopwith Camel, which is one of the planes that we see in the Battlefield 1 trailer, also gained a good reputation as a fighter aircraft. However, in terms of reputation, the Fokker DR triplane eclipsed all the fighters. Its association with the German ace Manfred von Richthofen certainly helped its cause by its design, gave the aircraft excellent maneuverability, and its rate of climb gave it a major advantage over the Allied fighters. As for the aircraft that we saw in the Battlefield 1 trailer, we'll go ahead and start with none other than the Fokker DR1 triplane. This was one of the most recognizable planes out there. Its top speed was 185 kilometers an hour. It had a range of 300 kilometers. It weighed 406 kilograms. It was manufactured by the Fokker company. It was first into service in July of 1917. The next aircraft we saw in the Battlefield 1 trailer is this one, the Sopwith Camel. The Sopwith Camel was a British First World War single-seat biplane fighter aircraft. Introduced on the Western Front in 1917, it was manufactured by the Sopwith Aviation Company. It used a rotary engine and it had twin synchronized machine guns. Another aircraft spotted in the Battlefield 1 trailer was this, the British Bristol F2 fighter. The Bristol F2 fighter was a British two-seat biplane, fighter and reconnaissance aircraft of the First World War. Developed by the British Aeroplane Company, it is often simply just called the Bristol Fighter. Its top speed was 198 kilometers an hour, it had a wingspan of 12 meters, and its first flight was on September the 9th of 1916. Next aircraft we're looking at is this one, the Gotha G.V. The Gotha G.V was a heavy bomber used during World War I. Designed for long-range service, the Gotha G.V was used primarily at night as a bomber. A top speed of 140 kilometers an hour, he had a range of 840 kilometers. His wingspan was 24 meters and its first flight was in 1915. Another biplane spotted in the trailer was this one, the Halberstadt CL. The Halberstadt CL was a German two-seat escort fighter ground attack aircraft of World War One. It served in large numbers. Its top speed was 165 kilometers an hour. It had a wingspan of 11 meters, and it was first introduced in 1917. And the last thing we got to see was this thing here. It's a Zeppelin. Now, there could be the L32, the LZ-74. This was first seen into service in 1916. It had a crew of 22, and it was primarily used for reconnaissance and bombing raids. By the end of 1914, the line between the Germans and the Allies stretched from the North Sea to the Alps. The initial war movement largely ceased, and the front became static. Three main functions of short-range reconnaissance squadrons had emerged by March of 1915. The first was photographic reconnaissance, building a complete mosaic map of the enemy trench system. The first air cameras used glass plates. Kodak cellulose film had been invented, but did not actually work properly because they had no sufficient resolution. Artillery spotting enabled the ranging of artillery targets invisible to the gunners. Radio telephony was not yet practical from an aircraft, and that created a problem. The early bombing efforts of 1914, a typical 1914 aircraft would carry only very small bomb loads. The bombs themselves and their stowage were very still elementary, and the effective bomb sites were still to be developed. When the Battle of Verdun began on the 21st of February of 1916, air superiority initially enabled the Germans to establish a blockade on the French air squadrons. However, the French were already arming their specialist fighter squadrons with this new offensive strategy. They quickly overcame the Germans, establishing air superiority over the battle by April of 1916. The first major military push for the American troops in World War I was the reduction of Saint-Mihiel. And it just so happened that this was one of the scenes for one of the largest major air battles of all time. Here, the Allies succeeded in assembling nearly 1,500 planes to counter the 500 on the German side. In terms of sheer numbers of the planes involved on both sides, most modern battles won't even come close to this vintage operation. So with that battle being one of the largest in World War I hope you guys have enjoyed the video. There's going to be a link in the description. That's going to take you to a YouTube channel if you want to learn more about the Great War. The cool thing is that if you go back 100 years to May of 1916, literally Verdun is happening right now. It's been going on for a few months, and there's going to be all sorts of cool stuff that you get to learn. Link is in the description if you want to learn a little bit more about the war. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will see you in the next one.